Hey everybody, welcome to my little presentation of completing the KA assessment for SPED 8533. I know a lot of you had questions about this assignment, so I tried to create this breakdown for you for those of you who need this method of presentation. So let me make sure this little guy changes. Here we go. All right, overview of the assignment. So the KA or key assessment assignment for this course means that it's a key assessment for the Masters of Education Special Education program. That means that I cannot change the rubric, and I really can't change the assignment itself very much. It's been validated, it's considered essential to our program, and is part of our accreditation. So that's why it is the way it is, and that I can't change that, the rubric piece, but also it's to let you know that this is really important in the scope and sequence of the program itself. So it is the main project for this course. It is where you apply the information you're learning throughout this assessment course. So I'm also going to talk through the rubric components so that to make sure that you all understand the focus of the assignment itself, and then the guiding template, highlighting the guiding template I made for you. So first of all, let's break down the assessment assignment itself. All right, so there are 6 main components of this assignment. You have the observation summaries, you have a collaboration piece, you have identification and justification of the assessment. This part's really key because that's a huge part of why you're focusing so closely in on assessment in this course. It's important that you understand how to identify and justify appropriate assessments for our students. The next section is actually two-parter. It's the data itself and then a data summary, which basically is the explanation of the data. The next part is the reflection of the process itself, and then there's a big component of this is learning goals and instructional strategies, and that piece has smaller subcomponents that we'll also get into. All right, so I broke down each section. In this slideshow, I included what the rubric in the exceeds section of the rubric says, as well as some, bullet pointed information on the right-hand side. Think of this as my key focus points, and let me shrink myself so you can read the whole thing, or move myself so you can read the whole thing, if it lets me move myself. There we go. Here, we'll go over here. Traveling Dr. Divine. Okay, oops, go back. All right, so the rubric guidelines for the observation summaries, that the candidate provides objective summaries that include complete descriptions of multiple observations of the target student. So not just one observation, but multiple observations. And they should be in more than one setting, occurring at different times in the school day. This includes a description of the environment, the times, the type of setting you're in, what kind of instruction is going on, if there's any, patterns of learning related to multiple areas: cognitive, linguistic, social, emotional, physical, and multiple aspects of behavior. This technically should be observations that take place over a period of more than 10 hours. The focus of the learner's actual learning style or strengths should also be presented and justified based on specific examples from those observations. Now, the challenge here, I want to highlight that we want to include detailed information about the observation, that they should be in a variety of settings, not just in one place in your classroom at one time of day, but also, maybe in the lunchroom, maybe on the playground, maybe in the hallway, maybe in another class, your students with a different teacher, and you go and observe them. So a variety of settings, or you're getting also observational summaries from other folks, your paraprofessional, other teachers that work with the student. This can be done before and or during the assessment process. So somebody could be taking observational information while you are delivering some type of assessment. These throughout this section, you're talking about what are the learning strengths of the student? What do you see in those observations? Learning styles is kind of a defunct term, but what do you see as strengths of the student you want to highlight so that you can make sure you're incorporating that in the learning, in the future learning for that student? If you are doing the case study as your primary source of information, you will use the information that you can glean from those summaries. But that means I don't want you to copy and paste. You need to rephrase everything in your own words from those summaries, okay? I realize if you are using one of your students from your classroom that you can't go back and do observations now. I'm hoping that you had previously recorded observations in some form or another, or have some of that from other teachers. This would be a good time maybe to reach out to other folks who have worked with that student and get some observational feedback from them that you can compile as part of this section of your study. A minimum of a couple paragraphs. I wouldn't do much more than 4 paragraphs here because it would get too long. So I'm not talking about 5 pages of summaries. I'm not talking about word for word 10 hours of transcript of observations. You're going to, the idea was that you completed these observations and you pulled together, summarized, synthesized that information into about a 2 to 4 paragraph section of your study. This is that informal data, right? How does a student behave in these different environments? How do they appear to learn well? What is maybe not so great for them? Those are the things you're focusing on in this section. It's not the, raw data tables that we're thinking about or focusing on here, okay? The next section of this paper is the collaboration piece. If you look on the left, the rubric guidelines include that the candidate provides clear and complete information. That means dates, times, settings, items discussed, and follow-up regarding contact with family members, other teachers, other staff, and community members working with or potentially working with the target student, and describes in detail the collaboration process utilized to identify both appropriate assessments and specific deficits of the target student. So in this section, you're emphasizing how you collaborated with others in order to get all of the assessment information for this student. If you are using one of your own students for this project, then you're going to talk about, the family interview that you did. Not necessarily all the results, but like what kind of collaboration did you do with them? When did it happen? What other teachers or related service personnel did you collaborate with in order to get all of the information that is needed for this assessment and for your student? If you're using the case study, you're going to include who did the assessments that were talked about in the case study. Now, you may not have a name of a person, but it may say a psychologist or something of that nature. You're going to share that information on there and include any relevant information to the collaboration process that you can find within that case study summary. Again, here, this would maybe be a couple of paragraphs. It does not have to be a bunch of pages. The identification and justification of assessment section. This is kind of one of the 2 major meat and potatoes of this, right? The rubric says that the candidate should list and describe developmentally appropriate assessment measures that target academics, adaptive behavior, and communication, and justifies the use of each based on specific individual learning differences from observation data and specific input from collaboration. So, what did the different folks that you collaborated with see as a as an area of need the student needs to be assessed in. So maybe teachers reported there were challenges in certain areas. So based on that information, the assessment that you're going to talk about, the assessments that you chose or that were chosen, you describe the type, purpose, how long that assessment takes, the method of assessment, how those are used, how frequently those types of assessments are administered. For example, curriculum-based measures are administered multiple times, whereas an intelligence test would be maybe once every 3 to 6 to 9 years. Okay, what is the measurement error, test bias, and advantages and disadvantages to this type of assessment? Now, some of that information is going to come from the research that you do over the course of the next couple of weeks. So when you're looking at publisher information about standardized assessments, they're going to give you that measurement error information, potential test bias. Some of the testing bias will come from your perspective as well. That's an important piece to consider, is that potential for test bias. So research your assessments, look up information about them. You can even look up articles that kind of evaluate different assessments and see what information you find. You're going to use this section to support or justify your choice or the use of the assessments that were used based on that research that you do. So it's important that you do some good background research. Was your assessment designed? Think about these questions, right? Was your assessment designed for your student? Was it designed for a student with autism? Was it designed for a student with autism who also has moderate or severe intellectual disabilities, if that fits your student, right? Think about your student. Does your student have English language barriers? Was your assessment designed to support a student who doesn't speak English as a first language? Is it designed for a student who's nonverbal, if your student is nonverbal? Think about all that stuff. When you're doing your research, you need to look at, was it validated? Was it found reliable? The publishing information should have information on validity and reliability testing. That's really an important part of using standardized assessments. And then you want to reflect on, was it administered appropriately? Again, you do your research there. How is this kind of test supposed to be administered? Was there specific training that needs to be involved? Were they following all the rules and procedures of that assessment process? And then if you find, especially because we're doing a lot of looking back, if you're using one of your students, instead of going through an assessment process ourselves, we're doing more of a reflective process here. If you find that the assessment or assessments that were used don't seem to be appropriate, talk about that in this section and talk about and provide some ideas for assessments that would be more appropriate. Okay, this is really important here. If you can really dig into this and look at whether assessments that were given are actually appropriate for your student, and be able to discuss that in a research-based way, you will be doing what's right for your students. Because we are talking about students with autism spectrum disorders along the range of their ability or challenges, many of our standardized assessments are not designed for this population. So it's important that you understand the parameters of that testing so that when you see that coming in from places, you can question it. And you can talk about, well, this is great information, but since it's not really designed for my student, perhaps could we look at these assessments, right? So always take assessment results with a grain of salt, because there's always testing bias you need to consider, and there's always the idea of, perhaps this test was not designed for your student, okay? Data and data summary is really two sections. I kind of combined them here. The data itself means, did you compile the raw and derived scores? Did you organize them in a table that's clearly labeled so I can understand it? If you're using a case study, this is the only time you can really kind of copy and paste information. You can take data tables from the case summary and put it in there. But what's important that you do is in the data summary itself, those need to be in your words. You need to then tell us in a clear way what that data is telling us about the target student's skills and deficits, and then sound justification for how those specific deficits may affect performance in the current classroom. Okay, so you should be somewhat familiar with how to do that, but this is the time when you really are learning more about what does the standard score mean, especially when you're talking about, a bell curve and all of that. What do those percentiles really mean? This is when you can really dig into what all those scores mean, so you can be a more knowledgeable representation or a person who can explain that to families in IEPs and so on. And when you're doing your own data gathering, that you understand what that psychologist report is saying. All right, so you should have tables. Make sure that your data summary is explaining the information in those tables and telling us what all those numbers mean. The next section is a reflection. This doesn't have to be very long, paragraph or two. And here you're going to talk about the multiple and specific changes in professional practice that you experienced based on both research that you did and the assessment data that you took or that you gathered. You reflect on how those changes to your professional practice have influenced student learning in multiple areas. So you begin with a reflection of your experience in this process of this KA assessment in general. Then you connect that to what you've learned over the course. How has professional practice changed when it comes to assessment? And then how does that tie to how you've changed as a professional during this project? How did what you have learned throughout this course affect your choices for this student's goals and instructional strategies? Did it have an effect, right? Hopefully it does. Hopefully it helps you dig deeper into this process and think it through a little more in depth. The final section, learning goals and instructional strategies, is actually multifaceted. It's got several components. I'm going to move my little face over again. So there should be 3 subsections here. You're going to do one on academics, you're going to do one on social skills, and you're going to do one on independent functioning. The rubric guidelines are very similar across each of those sections. Just see, if you see the fill in the blank line, you would put academics in there or social skills or independent functioning, depending on which section you're talking about. But basically, that within that section, you include developmentally appropriate goals for addressing that area, whether it's academics, social skills, or independent functioning, are presented that are directly aligned to the deficits presented in your earlier sections of observation summary, collaboration, and or the assessment data that you included. With those goals, you also need to include instructional strategies that are appropriate, varied, and well aligned with each goal. So think about it this way. These aren't just copy and paste IEP goals. These could be entirely new goals that you build because you've had a time to really dig into these assessment results. Based on these assessment results, what goals does your student really need to work on in each of those areas? And then along with that, you need to include evidence. You need to justify those goals. Evidence from the assessments you talked about before this point. And then you also need to include evidence-based instructional strategies that would help your student reach those goals. So as you're doing research for this course, start collecting and looking at those evidence-based instructional strategies that will help your student reach the goal. What are you going to teach them? And what strategy are you using to teach them? What supports are you going to include? And you're going to cite those things. So you will have a reference section, okay? So these, I don't want you to just bullet point a bunch of goals. You're going to break it down. You'll see the template, break down each section. You can have, the goal or goals listed, but make sure you're including the justification based on the assessment information, and you talk about instructional strategies that relate to that goal. I hope that makes sense. Here we go. Next. Come on. Here we go. Final overall consideration. As with everything that you submit, the rubric also includes language and convention. That means, do you have writing or spelling errors? Do you have APA type errors? Are you using academic language appropriately? So do not use contractions, for example. Also, if you use an acronym, make sure you spell it out the first time you use it. And then you can use the acronym from that point on. Are you using run-on sentences? Or are you using commas inappropriately? These are the things that you're going to be checking for here. And then person-first language should be used throughout. If you do not know what I mean by person-first language, then I'm going to tell you to look it up. At this point, you should definitely know what that means. And you should be using it in your writing, especially in our courses. You should be using it in your language, in your presentations. So that is important. If you have questions about person-first language, let me know. This is a great time to, have a friend read through and check for errors. Or if you're really, really bad with this, Grammarly is a great tool to help students who struggle in this area. But that is a consideration on the rubric. So, all right, now my final section here, and I gotta move my little face again, is the suggested schedule. So for those of you who struggle with procrastination, and some of you asked me or shared with me that you do struggle with that, and so breaking up an assignment is a big assignment works better for you. I'm not going to put due dates on here as far as what you turn into me, but I am going to give you this breakdown that maybe will help you. You can maybe use it as your own personal due dates. So weeks 1 and 2, and we're already finishing up week 2 here, is a time to start gathering information you're going to need for the KA assessment. So hopefully you've been working on that. After you go through this with me and you look at the template that I've made and then the rubric, you can start gathering some more information. Week 3, you're going to really want to work on completing the identification and justification of assessment section. This goes along with the activities you're doing in week 3, so it's a good time to work on the completion of that section for your final project. It doesn't mean it's the final draft, but at least start trying to work through that. Week 4, complete your observation summaries and collaboration section. You should have had time at that point to collect that information, do your family interview, or at least have it scheduled so you can start framing those sections of your KA assessment. Week 5, you'll want to complete the data and data summary sections. After you do that, then you start writing up goals, thinking of goal ideas, and finding those evidence-based instructional strategies that go with them. That doesn't mean you're in your final stage there, but within week 5, you're doing some digging into evidence-based practices. So it's a good time to work through that section, those 2 sections or 3 sections technically, to some degree, okay? It aligns nicely with the content of the course at that point. Week 6, you would complete your reflection since you've gone through most of the process now, and then the learning goals and instructional strategies sections. So the previous week, you started coming up with your goals and the instructional strategies. Week 6 is when you can start writing up that whole section in a way that makes sense and is tying all those pieces together. Week 7, now that you've done basically a rough draft of the entire thing, this is when you complete your final read through. You can have a friend help check for errors in spelling, grammar, etc. And you will submit it in week 7 or July 6th for this summer. So hopefully that helps those of you who are not sure how to break it down. This is a good guideline to help keep you on track without trying to do all of it in week 6. That way too, if you run across questions, issues, hurdles, you can reach out to me before we get too far along. All right, I hope this helps. Enjoy, take care, and we will see you later.